Hi Booktube, and welcome to another video. I'm going to talk about my first ever buddy read, which was of this book, A Constellation of Vital Phenomena by Anthony Marra, which I buddy read with Curtis Books and Books. And what a delightful companion to have to guide me through popping my my cherry of buddy reads. And before we start talking about the book, it's just worth saying that this book was brought to my attention, and possibly Curtis's as well, by Sean the Book Maniac, because when he did his epigrams tag, this was one of the books that he centred it on, and he mentioned that it was his second favourite book of all time, which, you know, when Sean says that, you stand up and take notice. And for me, when I found out it's about Chechnya, which is an area of the world that I'm reasonably obsessed with, that clinched the deal. So I bought the book. But it then so happened that Sean ran a competition to mark his 1,000 subscribers that he'd hit. And he was doing a giveaway. And it's just so happened that Curtis won this book. At which point we sort of compared notes and said, oh, let's buddy read it once it arrives by snail mail from Japan. So it's been sitting there in my TBR pile, sort of waiting for the green light for when it arrives through the post at Curtis's house, which it did. And we embarked on a buddy read. So I think before I get into the details of the book, from my point of view, it's just worth saying that we were both blown away by this book, which shouldn't be surprising because Sean, the Book Maniac, has impeccable literary tastes. So the fact this is one of his all-time favourite books, you know, you knew you were in for a great read, and this was a great read. And Curtis and I didn't really diverge in opinion all that much, which may also have made it quite a sort of soft and gentle buddy read. But we did talk a lot about it in our interchanges. We did 50 pages a day, although towards the end we speeded up because we both wanted to, you know, how does this finish, you know. So there are about 4 or 5 characters that this book focuses in on. And it's over a 20-year period? Yeah, it's a 10-year period in which there were 2 wars of independence for the Republic of Chechnya, in which the Russian government refused to allow them independence. So unlike all the Bulgaria and East Germany and Hungary and all of that, which, you know, had gone their own ways from the Soviet Union once it sort of started to break up, they weren't prepared to let some of the sort of landlocked republics within Soviet Russia itself go, of which Chechnya was the main one. And there were 2 brutal wars were fought, and that is the time span of this book. And Chechnya, which I didn't know, this is one of the things that Mara informed me of. There were 2 facts I didn't know. One, that during the Second World War, Stalin saw the Chechens as potentially disloyal because of their Muslim faith, and they were all sent. You know, they were all kicked out of Chechnya and relocated in Kazakhstan. I had no idea of that. You know, not dissimilar to what the Khmer Rouge did in Cambodia. They took everyone. You know, everyone left the country. That was the first thing. And the second thing I didn't know was that sort of the branch of Islam in Chechnya is the Sufi branch, which is a very gentle, spiritual, artistic version of Islam, which leads to things like the whirling dervishes, which leads to things like Qawwali music, which I love Qawwali music. So it's people like Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. Now, you normally associate that sort of Pakistan and India. I didn't realise that it was in, you know, Chechnya as well. But because the Chechen cause became a sort of open invitation to sort of jihadists all over the world, that they poured into the country to fight alongside the Chechens, and they brought with them militant Wahhabism Islam, which is the same thing that propels ISIS. And of course ISIS would regard Sufi Islam as heretical in the same way as it does Shia Islam and the Yazidis and all of that, and you know, they would obliterate them. So the war for independence was part sort of motivated by nationalism and part by sort of, you know, Islamic self-determination, but it increasingly became more about the Islamic self-determination as all these, you know, more radical fighters poured in from elsewhere in the world. So that is the, you know, the context of the book. And I knew quite a lot about the war because I read a brilliant book by Nikolai Lilin called Freefall, where he was a Russian sniper in a special unit in that war, and it's brutal. It's whatever the atrocities in Vietnam, like My Lai and things like that, they're cubed and to the power of 4 in Chechnya, because it was a really dirty war. Things like planting explosive devices on corpses, so when people came to clear them up to bury them, they'd be blown up. Lots of stuff like that. But this book, the beauty of this book is it conveys that sense of utter desolation of war without long passages of description. It does it in a phrase or an image or a metaphor. It is so beautifully economical. And it is concerned with four characters within Chechnya, and it's very much on the personal level. And as Curtis said, he used the word telescope. That the background of the war is telescoped, through us following the lives of these 4 characters, and it's so incredibly well done. So that there are certain images. So, for example, the Russians bombers overhead drop lots of ordnance on villages. Some of it doesn't go off, so these unexploded shells lying around. So what the villagers did, from the destroyed ruins of houses, they ripped out the toilets and they put them over the exploded devices so that people wouldn't accidentally trip on them. But also, if they did explode, the ceramic was so well made that it contained the blast, so there was no shrapnel and people didn't get injured. No one got injured from these unexploded devices. And Marra's line is, it's the only decent thing in the whole history of Soviet communism that ever got made were the toilets. So, and that sums up the book, because you get this sort of horrendous brutality of the war, but a sort of bureaucratic madness of how they sort of manage in this case to mollify and ameliorate the danger of it, and that permeates this the whole time. That it veers from sort of humour or bureaucratic madness suddenly with one word or phrase and you're reappraised with the horror of it. So, for example, one of the characters, who's the father of one of the main 4 characters, who's a little girl, she's called Hava. Her father was basically running guns to the rebels and gets captured with the driver, who's another one, who is one of the main 4 characters. He's called Ramzan. And they end up in a Russian torture place called Landfill. And Hava's father has all his fingers pulled off with pliers, so there's only stumps left on his hands. But he's released because basically Ramzan does a deal with the Russians and says he'll become an informer for them. And the one thing he asks for is if his mate, Hava's father, can be released, which they are. And there's a scene when he's called Docker, Hava's father, and when he goes back home, his wife is dying of natural causes, and there's this beautiful image where, husband and wife at her deathbed, and she reaches out for his hand, and normally husbands and wives, they might do that or they might do that. He has no fingers, so there's this image of it as she's dying. She just puts her hand over the stumps of his fingers and sort of does that. And, I don't cry when I read. And I didn't at that, but I felt like, up here I felt, God, ugh. And, this book is full of moments like that. It is just so brilliant. So on every chapter, I don't know if you can see this, there's a timeline. And one of the years will be highlighted in bold. And notionally, that's the year that's sort of understudy, as it talks about one of the 4 main characters in that year. But it jags about all over the place. This book is non-linear. It is not a freely flowing, even though you have this timeline, within any one chapter, it doesn't stick to that. And all throughout, I wondered what this, why was that? What's this doing? And gradually towards the end, I realised, and I suggested to Curtis, actually it's a complete red herring. This book isn't about time. This book is about space. Because the whole village is pretty much emptied of people. Either they've fled, or they've been killed in the landfill because Ramza has dobbed them into the authorities. And there's only about 4 people left in the village. So they're sort of, padding around this, this ghost. It's not a town, but this ghost village. So there's this sort of sense of space and emptiness that these characters move in, and yet it's also extremely claustrophobic. Because in pre-war in village life, everyone knew everybody's business, and you couldn't escape it unless you went out into the forests, which is what Ramzan has to do when he talks to his Russian puppet masters. He has to go 3 miles out into the forest for complete isolation, which is ironic because no one will speak to him in the environment because they all know he's an informer for the Russians. So the only person who speaks to him, even his dad, who he lives with, won't speak to him. The only person who will speak to him is this Russian controller. So all the time there's this sort of dislocation of space, which war brings about, obviously. So these villages and towns are cleared out by war. But for the people who remain in it, it's completely claustrophobic, even though there's no one else around. It's an extraordinary achievement, I think. And Grozny, which is the capital of Chechnya, was completely levelled. Absolutely every building was levelled by the Russian carpet bombing. So again, you have this sort of wide expanse of space, and yet the desolation just makes it, close in on you, even though it's just nothing there. It's like an urban desert. It's like an urban desert. So the books that this reminded me of was Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, because a lot of the book is about the madness, the bureaucratic madness of the war. So, for example, the Russian soldiers are paid according to how many bullets they've shot in anger in war. And they cotton onto this very quickly and think, well, let's just fire our bullets into the air at the end of the month and make it look as though we fired more than we have. So they do. Or they bury them. Again, it looks like they fired off this ammo and they get paid accordingly. And then after they've been paid, they dig them up and say, look, here's a rebel cache of arms. And they get paid a bonus, which is very Catch-22. And it's very Soviet bureaucracy. What's remarkable about this, and this reminded me of another book, which is Solo by Rana Dasgupta that I read this year. Anthony Marra is American. Rana Dasgupta is British Indian. And they are writing about pretty unexplored, undiscovered areas of Europe. Dasgupta did it with Bulgaria and Georgia, and here obviously this is Chechnya. But these guys are outsiders. They didn't live any of this experience, but they do such a good job. They invest such detail about it that it reads absolutely authentic. And what I think Marra does so well, I've read plenty of Russian authors, including Nikolai Lilin's non-fiction book Freefall, which I mentioned, because that starts with his recruitment, which is a complete Kafkaesque bureaucracy thing. That anyone who lived under state Soviet communism encountered this sort of bureaucratic madness all the time. And Victor Pelevin is an author who's very good at this. And Marra brings it off, even though he never lived under it. And as I say, to me, that's a remarkable achievement. This is a book about the bureaucratic madness of war. So a film like Apocalypse Now is about the sort of hallucinatory, drug-induced nature of war. It's so beyond one's everyday perception. But these are the other end of the coin, where it's not phantasmagoric at all. It's very mundane and banal and mad, crazy, bureaucracy. And there's, so an example of that is one of the characters called not Ahmed. One of the characters, yes, the father of Ramzan, who won't talk to him. He has a life sort of mission where he's writing the history of Chechnya, but he's only allowed to write, basically the prehistory, because the Russian authorities won't, they won't have anything that goes against the party line. But he still writes it in secret. It's about 3,000-page book on the history of Chechnya. But very much a landscape history as well as the social and cultural history. And the Russian authorities are only interested in the landscape almost before it's populated. That they permit. The rest he doesn't dare send. But as the Soviet Union starts to fall apart, and you get Yeltsin, and then you get what happens after. His editors change, and the prevailing winds change, and it looks a better prospect for the book to be published and stuff. So there's a chapter devoted to the history, the rise and falls and sweeps and editorial changes and stuff about the book. But there's a brilliant bit in it, sort of early on, when it was still under a sort of Soviet regime, where he's advised by a sort of state editor, going, well, make it longer than it needs to be, because then any of its inevitable failings politically of its line will just be put down to an overweening ambition. You won't be held responsible for it and shot, basically, for going against the party line, which is as a writer, that's a fantastic nugget of. Well, make it longer so that's the reason it will fail. So it will fail, but let's make the best out of a bad job, and it fails because it's too ambitious. Again, this sort of bureaucratic madness, even in literature and art. And I just think that's brilliant. And the other book it reminded me of was Jonathan Safran Foer's Everything is Illuminated, which is set in the Ukraine in a disappeared Jewish rural ghetto, which are called shtetls. And there, that vanished community is brought back to life in the book, and it's quirky and offbeat. And this is, even though this community has almost vanished because of the war, either fled or killed, I think Marra achieves the same thing of bringing, a way of life that's quite exotic. It's not Russian. Well, it is Russian, but it's Chechen as well, and it's only Russian in the sense of the mad bureaucratic stuff that's laid on top of the sort of Chechen life. So those are the two books that it very much reminded me of, and also Dasgupta's Solo. I'm just going to check my notes to see if there's anything else that I've missed. Yeah, so just again, another example of the sort of bureaucratic madness. So this is under the bureaucratic madness. This is the madness of war. So basically, the focus of the action is the village and then the local hospital. And Ahmed is the character that links the two, because he still lives in the village, one of the few left, but he goes to work in this hospital. And he's the worst doctor in his village, but because all the doctors have fled or been killed, the whole hospital is being run by one doctor, female doctor called Sonia, who's an ethnic Russian. She's not Chechen, but she grew up in Chechnya, and her nurse. And they run the whole hospital, so they sort of gladly take him on because they have no, all hands to the pump. But they are giving, the bureaucratic madnesses, they are trying to give their patients the impression this is still a fully functioning hospital with loads of staff and stuff. Again, this sort of mad sort of double speak, all the stuff that Orwell did in 1984 was true, slightly lesser scale, but it was true in Russia. But because of the war, the four-story hospital all goes into the basement because the upper floors are vulnerable. So one of the wards that gets closed is the gerontology ward, the old people's ward. So closing the gerontology ward at the hospital under the general consensus that prolonging the lives of the elderly was a peacetime enterprise. Chilling, that you can only afford to treat the old and the sick, really, people who've got disease rather than shrapnel wounds, is a luxury of peacetime. Think about that for a moment. This has flipped the whole thing on its head, that war is the natural state, and it's the bits in between the two Chechen wars that are the fleeting, privileged state of being. It was slightly odd doing a buddy read in that because you want to keep pace with each other, you set each other targets of pages. We'll do 50 pages today, and so it's not quite the same as an organic read where you sort of read until you want to stop reading for the day. But the beauty of this book was you pick the book up the next day and you're straight into genius writing, because it's not long passages and long descriptions. It's like bang, veer, vertiginously into another, brilliant observation. So I'm just going to give you an example of that. So they're driving to Grozny because Ahmed has never, Sonia's driving him to Grozny, to pick up supplies, and Ahmed has never been to Grozny. He's never really left his small village and the local town where the hospital is. So they're driving to Grozny. 15 silent minutes, and this is the start of chapter 11, which happened to be the start of a new reading day for me and Curtis. 15 silent minutes passed before he flipped on the radio and gave the dial a quarter turn. A crush of warm static filled the cabin. "There's no working radio tower in the country. It's all static," she said without looking at him. "I know, but 102.3 plays the best. Not too tinny. Full and robust. If a cello were to perform static, it would sound like this." She shook her head and turned the dial. "I prefer 93.9, she said. She still hadn't looked at him. "It's too thin and monotone. There's no variation. It just sounds like static." "And that's why I like it," she said. "It sounds like the static it's supposed to sound." He reeled the dial to the far end. 106.7, he said. "Just listen." Snatches of foreign transmissions laced the white noise. Syllables surfaced like glowing bubbles from the harsh swirl, voices in a storm. She turned the dial back to 93.9 and they listened to static sounding static. Fog fell over the fields. A bus was parked in a meadow. Paint chips pointed down a gravel road to the rusted remains of a tractor factory. Dormant smokestacks. Nowhere was a fire less likely to be found than inside a factory furnace. Genius. I mean, that whole sort of, surreal discussion about the different qualities of static to listen to, because there's nothing else to listen to. And they're arguing over which is a better, more audible form of static. I mean, I just think that's genius. And I mean, in the same paragraph, they talk about a factory with their smokestacks from where no smoke's coming out because the factories are disused in the war. Nowhere was a fire less likely to be found than inside a factory furnace. Why? Because the whole landscape is burning. And that's what I mean by he just manipulates the reader so beautifully from humour and bureaucratic madness to horror, the horror of the war. And, this is just a fabulous, fabulous book. I'm going to see if there's one more thing I'm going to read, or I'm going to leave it at that. Oh yes, so this is the sort of the grim reality of the Russian forces that the Chechens were facing. The draft soldiers in the blue uniforms are scared teenagers. They are what we might call the victims of absurdism, he said, not one to miss an opportunity to lecture a captive audience. They would surrender if you waved a soup spoon at them. Most can't find Chechnya on a map and don't care if Putin, Maskhadov or Father Christmas presides over the Republic. Most arrive by train in passenger carriages, but most will return as cargo 200, sealed within zinc-lined coffins in the freights. But the kontrakatniki, the ones you see wearing sleeveless black t-shirts to show off their tattoos, they are nihilists, immoralists or misanthropists, take your pick. They were released from prison provided they serve a certain number of years in Chechnya. They want to be here, because this is the only place they can express their true nature. And if I weren't hiding behind a log, I suppose I might even admire them, because they are committed to the dialectics of their philosophy, no matter how horrid. They're psychopaths, and they like war. They're not soldiers, because soldiers have too much discipline. They are psychopaths who can indulge their love of killing, and, that was a part of the war. Stunning, stunning book. 5 stars, almost certain to get into my top books of the year. What are we, 7 months in? But so thanks to Curtis, Books and Books, for a really enjoyable experience of my first buddy read. And thanks to Sean the Book Maniac, because I hadn't heard of this book. I hadn't heard of this writer. And Sean brought him to mine and possibly Curtis's awareness. And I, for one, and I think Curtis too, although I don't want to speak for Curtis, very grateful that Sean did so. So, till next time, thanks very much.